The Black Hawk's rotors drummed a thunderous rhythm that Sarah Mitchell felt in her chest as the helicopter banked sharply over the Hindu Kush Mountains. Through the open side door, she could see the sprawling compound of Forward Operating Base Kandahar emerging from the haze like a mirage, a collection of concrete barriers, blast walls, and Quonset huts surrounded by razor wire and sandbags. It was August 2011, and the temperature outside hovered near 115 degrees. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dust across her skin. She'd done this before, 2 deployments to Iraq, countless search and rescue operations stateside, but this felt different. This assignment carried a weight she couldn't quite articulate. The helicopter descended in a cloud of dust so thick that Sarah could barely see 5 feet beyond the aircraft. She gripped her duffel bag and waited for the signal from the crew chief. When it came, she moved quickly, her boots hitting the tarmac with purposeful strides. The rotors were still spinning as she hustled clear, keeping her head low even though clearance was never an issue. Military habit. She'd learned years ago that complacency in a war zone was a luxury that got people killed. As the noise faded and the dust settled, Sarah got her first real look at the base. It was uglier than the photographs had suggested, more worn, more battle-scarred. The concrete barriers bore bullet holes and blast marks like scars from past wounds. The buildings were utilitarian, functional, devoid of any aesthetic consideration beyond stopping shrapnel and small arms fire. Soldiers moved between structures with the practiced efficiency of people living in a dangerous routine. No one was rushing. No one looked panicked. To them, this was simply Tuesday. Then she saw them. The Navy SEAL team was standing in formation about 50 yards away, deliberately positioned so she'd have to walk directly toward them. There were 5 men, all broad-shouldered and lean, their faces darkened by sun and dust. They wore a uniform of tactical fatigue and competence, and every single one of them was watching her approach with an expression somewhere between curiosity and disdain. The man in front was taller than the others, with a sharp jawline and eyes the color of slate. Sarah recognized him from the mission briefing, Lieutenant Commander Jake Reeves, the operations tactical lead. He had a reputation that preceded him, 15 years of special operations experience, 2 Medal of Valor nominations, a perfect mission completion record. He was also, Sarah had learned from her sources, deeply skeptical about having a female operator assigned to his team. Captain Sarah Mitchell. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Sir," she executed a crisp salute, still holding her duffel bag in her left hand. Standard protocol, though she immediately sensed it was unnecessary. These men didn't operate by textbook formality. Reeves returned the salute with minimal effort, his eyes scanning her from boots to face. "Combat medic, huh?" The way he said it made the word sound like an accusation. "Heard you came highly recommended." He paused, and there was a beat of silence that felt intentional. "By people who have never operated in the field with a woman." Sarah's neck flushed hot, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd trained herself for this, the skepticism, the condescension, the assumption that her presence was somehow a compromise of operational integrity. "Sir, I've completed 22 combat missions, primarily in Iraq. My record is—" "I've read your file." Reeves turned slightly, gesturing to the other team members. "This is Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen, our heavy weapons specialist. Petty Officer Garrett Thompson, Communications. Chief Petty Officer David Novick, Operations. And Ensign Raymond Watts, our newest guy, Logistics and Support." The men nodded or grunted acknowledgement, but none of them smiled. Their body language made it clear they'd already decided who Sarah was before she'd arrived. "You'll be staying in the female quarters. We converted one of the old storage containers last year. Seems we finally had a use for it." The implication was clear. She was so unexpected, so unusual, that they'd only recently bothered to prepare accommodations. "Yes, sir," Sarah said, shouldering her duffel bag. "Where should I?" "Your primary role is medical. You'll carry a standard combat loadout, but you're not on the tactical roster. You provide support, field stabilization, and evacuation coordination. You stay with the vehicles unless there's a casualty. Clear. Sarah wanted to argue. She'd qualified as a gunner, had logged hundreds of rounds on the range, had studied tactical doctrine and combat medicine in equal measure. But she understood the hierarchy. Reeves outranked her, and more importantly, he held the power to make her deployment either productive or unbearable. She'd learned that lesson the hard way in Iraq. "Crystal clear, sir." Reeves nodded, then turned to Chen. "Get her settled. Briefing is at 1900 hours. He walked away without waiting for a response, his team following like a school of predators moving in formation. Chen gestured for Sarah to follow him. He was smaller than Reeves, maybe 5'9", but his build suggested the kind of functional strength that came from years of intensive military training. As they walked toward the female quarters, literally a converted shipping container painted tan to blend with the desert, he spoke in a low voice. "Don't take it personal," he said. "Command sent you down from Bagram without consulting the team. Reeves doesn't like surprises, and he doesn't like people he didn't personally select. He's not sexist, exactly. He's just selective about who he trusts with his life." "And he doesn't trust me because I'm a woman," Sarah said flatly. "He doesn't trust you because he doesn't know you." Chen stopped at the container door. "Reeves has lost 2 people in 12 years of operations. 2. That's extraordinary in his line of work. He's paranoid about compatibility, about whether people can stay calm under pressure, whether they'll fold when things go sideways. In his mind, you're an unknown variable. The fact that you're female just gives him another layer of doubt." Sarah opened the container door. Inside was a cot, a footlocker, a small desk, and a window with a view of the base's northern perimeter. It was sparse and utilitarian, but it was hers. "So how do I change his mind?" she asked. Chen smiled faintly. "You don't. You just do your job better than anyone's ever done it before. You save lives. You keep your head when everything's chaos. You prove through actions, not words, that you belong here. Reeves doesn't value speeches. He values results." He turned to leave, then paused. "And fair warning, the first real operation, he's going to test you. Everyone gets tested. Yours is just going to be a little harder because he starts from a position of doubt." After he left, Sarah sat on the cot and let the exhaustion of travel finally settle over her. The container was already heating up and sweat began dripping down her temples. She'd faced skepticism before. She'd been one of only 3 female combat medics in her entire division in Iraq, and she'd proven herself a dozen times over. But Reeves felt different. His doubt wasn't casual or easily dismissed. It was methodical, professional, rooted in the absolute seriousness of his work. She pulled out her phone, knowing she had limited time to charge it, and texted her wife. "Arrived safely. Team is. Traditional. Will prove myself. Love you." The response came quickly. "You always do. Love you more. Be safe." Sarah set the phone down and looked around the container. This was her space for the next 6 months, maybe longer depending on the mission schedule. Outside, she could hear the sounds of a military base at war, voices calling out orders, vehicles moving, distant explosions from a training range or active operation. This was her world now. She stood, unpacked her gear, and mentally prepared herself for the briefing. Reeves wanted to see if she could handle the pressure. Fine. She'd been handling pressure her entire life, coming out as a lesbian in the military, building a career in a male-dominated field, proving that capability had nothing to do with gender. One skeptical SEAL wasn't going to break her. She checked her watch. 4 hours until the briefing. She had work to do. Share artifacts, download all SEAL story document. MD. The first week at Forward Operating Base Kandahar was deceptive. Nothing happened. Sarah attended briefings, studied maps, reviewed operational procedures, and helped maintain the medical supplies in the small clinic attached to the SEAL team's headquarters. Reeves barely acknowledged her existence beyond tactical necessities. He assigned her to the night watch rotation, a deliberate slight, as everyone understood that watch duty was a punishment assignment. But Sarah didn't complain. She knew the game. She just had to wait for her opportunity. It came on the 8th day. The dawn patrol was supposed to be routine. A sweep of the Arghandab River Valley, checking on local informants, verifying intelligence about Taliban movement patterns. Sarah was assigned to the second vehicle, positioned behind Petty Officer Chen. As they drove through the winding mountain roads, the landscape was almost beautiful, terraced agriculture clinging to hillsides, mud brick compounds scattered across the terrain, the Arghandab River gleaming in the early morning light. It was easy to forget they were in one of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. Then the IED detonated. The explosion wasn't aimed at their vehicle. It hit a checkpoint 3 kilometers ahead where the first team had stopped. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, and instantly the radio erupted with chatter. Reeves' voice cut through the noise with surgical precision, ordering the convoy to move. Their Humvee accelerated, bouncing over rough terrain as they raced toward the blast site. Sarah gripped the medical bag strapped across her chest, her mind already cycling through triage protocols. From the size of the explosion, they'd need everything: pressure bandages, tourniquets, intravenous lines, potentially emergency surgery. When they arrived at the checkpoint, Sarah's worst expectations were confirmed. The blast had caught 2 soldiers in the open. One had shrapnel wounds across his left side, his arm hanging at an angle that suggested fracture or dislocation. The other was worse, deep laceration across his abdomen, bleeding profusely, going into shock. Sarah was moving before the Humvee fully stopped. She dropped from the vehicle and sprinted toward the wounded soldiers, her training overriding everything else. The checkpoint was still taking sporadic fire from the hills, nothing organized, just opportunistic Taliban fighters trying to capitalize on the chaos. Reeves shouted orders for covering fire as Sarah knelt beside the more critically wounded soldier. His name was Jackson, a private from the 82nd Airborne, and he was losing consciousness. She applied pressure to the abdominal wound, feeling the slickness of blood through her fingers. "Stay with me, Jackson. I need you to stay with me," she said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She pulled the trauma shears from her vest and began cutting away his uniform to assess the full extent of the damage. The bleeding was coming from multiple sources: a large laceration across the abdomen, secondary wounds on his left leg, possible internal injuries she couldn't treat in the field. "Tourniquet now," she called out, and Chen appeared with the equipment. She cinched it around Jackson's leg just above the knee, securing the strap with practiced efficiency. The tourniquet would hurt like hell, but it would save his leg if he survived. "Jackson, I'm starting an IV," she explained, finding a vein in his right arm even as his blood pressure dropped. Her hands were steady, her voice clinical. Around her, bullets were still hitting the checkpoint walls, but she developed the rare ability to compartmentalize fear. There was her job. Everything else was secondary. The IV went in cleanly. She began running saline, trying to counteract the shock that was claiming Jackson's consciousness. His eyes flickered, focusing on her face for a moment. "Am I dying?" he whispered. "No," Sarah said firmly, "but you're going to feel like hell for a while. Just keep breathing for me. In and out, nice and steady." She transitioned to the second soldier, the one with the arm injury and shrapnel wounds. His name was Corporal Diaz, and he was conscious and furious. "Get me back in the fight," he demanded, even as Sarah was wrapping his arm. "You're not fighting with a separated shoulder and fragment lacerations," she said flatly, not bothering to look up. "You're going to medical and you're going to let the doctors fix you, and maybe you'll be back operational in 2 weeks. Until then, you're done." She had both soldiers stabilized within 10 minutes. The firefight had largely died down. Reeves and his team had established superior positions on the hills, forcing the Taliban fighters to retreat. A medevac helicopter was inbound, 15 minutes out. Sarah stayed with Jackson and Diaz during those 15 minutes, monitoring their vital signs, adjusting the IV flow, talking them through the pain and fear. She was covered in blood, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline now that the immediate crisis had passed. But her eyes were clear, her mind focused. When the medevac arrived and the medical evacuation personnel took over, one of them, a grizzled sergeant with the combat medical insignia of 30 years' experience, paused beside Sarah. "That was good work, Captain," he said. "The leg tourniquet was placed perfectly. You probably saved that kid's limb." He looked at her more closely. "How long you been in?" 11 years, Sarah replied. "It shows." He climbed into the helicopter, and moments later it lifted off, rotor wash kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Sarah stood motionless, watching the helicopter disappear into the morning sky. Her uniform was soaked with blood. Her hands were shaking. She felt simultaneously exhausted and wired, that peculiar state that came after adrenaline faded but remained close enough to surge again. Reeves appeared beside her, and for a moment she thought he might say something. His expression was unreadable. "Good field work," he said finally, his voice clipped and professional. Then he turned away to coordinate security and equipment gathering. That was all. No gratitude, no acknowledgement that she'd potentially saved lives. Just good field work, the kind of observation he might make about someone checking a weapon or tying a knot correctly. But Chen caught her eye across the compound, and he nodded, a gesture of respect that meant something. Over the following weeks, opportunities for Sarah to prove herself came regularly. A soldier collapsed from heat exhaustion during a patrol. Sarah recognized the signs before he fully went down and treated him on the spot. An operation in Helmand Province resulted in one of the Afghan National Police officers taking a bullet wound. Sarah got him stable and walking again within 48 hours. When Watts broke his wrist during a training exercise, Sarah improvised a field cast that held perfectly until he could reach the base hospital. Each success was met with the same response from Reeves, acknowledgement of competence, nothing more. His wall of skepticism remained intact. He still assigned her secondary status on operational rosters. He still positioned her as support rather than tactical asset. But something had shifted. He no longer looked at her with doubt. He looked at her with neutral assessment. The rest of the team was different. Chen started eating meals with her, including her in the gym rotation, treating her as an actual teammate rather than an attachment. Novik began asking her medical opinions during briefings, treating her expertise with genuine respect. Even Watts, the newest member of the team, seemed to regard her as an equal. But Reeves remained the constant holdout. The commander, the one whose respect still felt distant, still felt unearned. Sarah understood that this was the test Chen had warned her about. Reeves was waiting for something, some moment where her competence would be tested under conditions beyond routine field medicine. He was waiting to see if she could keep her head when everything was chaos, whether she could stay calm when lives hung in the balance, whether she could make the kind of split-second decisions that separated good operators from great ones. She didn't know it yet, but that test was coming much sooner than she expected. And when it arrived, everything would change. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Too straightforward, Sarah realized later. They were conducting what intelligence classified as a low-risk intelligence gathering operation in Lagar province, about 40 kilometers south of the main base. The target was a Taliban logistics hub that had supposedly been abandoned 2 weeks earlier. The plan was simple: move in, photograph evidence, interview local informants, extract. 2 hours maximum. Reeves had called it a milk run before the operation, a colloquial dismissal that meant so easy it was almost boring. Sarah should have known that's when things went wrong. The convoy departed at 500 hours before dawn. 3 Humvees, each equipped with mounted M240 machine guns. 20 personnel total, including the SEAL team, Army Rangers, and support staff. The drive through the mountains was surprisingly peaceful. The road wound between terraced hillsides where farmers were already beginning their work, women in burqas moving between fields, children watching the convoy pass with the blank curiosity of those accustomed to war. Sarah sat in the second vehicle directly behind Reeves' command Humvee. Chen was driving, Novak in the turret manning the mounted gun, Thompson beside her checking communications equipment. The radio hummed with periodic updates from the other vehicles. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. They were 3 kilometers from the target when the first RPG detonated. The explosion was deafening even from their distance. Sarah watched in slow motion as Reeves' vehicle, the lead Humvee, seemed to lift off the ground. Metal screamed. Windows exploded. The vehicle careened toward the cliff edge on the right side of the narrow mountain pass before skidding to a halt, trailing smoke. "Contact!" Novak screamed, already swinging the mounted gun toward the hillside where the RPG had originated. "Multiple positions. We're in a valley ambush." Chen slammed the accelerator, accelerating toward the lead vehicle, but immediately rounds began impacting their Humvee. The windshield starred, fragmented but holding. A round punched through the side panel with a sickening metallic shriek. "Left side," Thompson shouted, pointing. Enemy fighters were emerging from concealed positions on the hill to their left. RPGs, small arms fire, grenades. The ambush had been perfectly executed, coordinated from 3 directions, designed to cut off all escape routes and pin them in the valley like fish in a barrel. Chen threw the vehicle into park and was already out, taking cover behind the engine block, returning fire with his rifle. The world became chaos. Explosions, gunfire, shouting, the acrid smell of cordite and burning metal. Sarah's medical training screamed at her to remain in the vehicle, but combat experience told her something different. She could hear screams from Reeves' vehicle. "I'm going forward," she yelled at Thompson, not waiting for approval. She grabbed her medical bag and moved, staying low, using the vehicles as cover. Rounds kicked up dust around her feet, but her focus narrowed to a single point, the damaged lead vehicle and whoever needed help inside it. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chen was already laying down devastating suppressive fire, his M4 snapping out short, controlled bursts that forced the enemy on the left side to keep their heads down. Sarah reached the lead vehicle and found her worst fears confirmed. The driver was unconscious, blood streaming from his forehead. The gunner was already dead, his body slumped in the turret. In the passenger seat, Reeves was checking for a pulse on the unconscious driver, his jaw tight. "Vitals," he demanded, not looking up. "I've got him," Sarah said, moving into the vehicle. The driver's pulse was weak but present. Head wound, possible concussion, possible intracranial bleeding. She couldn't treat that here. She could stabilize him. "We need to move him." "Not yet. We're pinned." Reeves paused as another explosion rocked the valley closer this time. The enemy was advancing, moving down from the hills. "Stay with him. Don't move him unless absolutely necessary." Reeves moved back to the turret, replacing the dead gunner, and began returning fire with the mounted M240. The gun roared, a sound like the world tearing apart, expending ammunition at a rate that would empty the belt in seconds. Behind them, Sarah could hear Thompson shouting into the radio, calling for air support. The response crackled back. No assets available for 30 minutes. 30 minutes. They didn't have 30 seconds if the enemy kept advancing at this rate. Sarah worked on the driver, cleaning the head wound, applying pressure to minimize bleeding. His eyes fluttered, semi-conscious. "Stay with me," she whispered, the words automatic. "Just stay with me." Then Thompson screamed. Sarah's head snapped around. In the second vehicle, Thompson was pulling himself back into the gunner's position, blood streaming down his left shoulder. He'd taken shrapnel, or a round. Sarah couldn't tell from this distance. But he was still fighting, still trying to lay down fire even as his left arm hung at an odd angle. The enemy fire intensified. They weren't organized militias, these were trained fighters, probably Taliban cadre with combat experience. They were using the terrain expertly, bounding between positions, keeping the team suppressed. The SEAL team was returning fire with superior accuracy, but they were outnumbered, outpositioned, and running low on ammunition. Another explosion, this one so close that Sarah felt the concussion wave. Dirt rained down on the vehicle. She covered the driver's body instinctively, protecting him from shrapnel. Her medical bag was soaked with blood. His blood, her blood from a graze wound she hadn't even registered yet. Reeves was screaming orders now, his tactical mind running calculations. Sarah could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, that subtle shift that meant the situation was deteriorating toward critical. "We're losing firepower," Chen shouted from his position. "Thompson's hit, we can't suppress their movement." It was true. With Thompson wounded and the gunner in Reeves' vehicle dead, their rate of fire had dropped dramatically. The enemy was advancing, using the terrain to creep closer, preparing to assault their positions. Sarah had seen this dynamic before in Iraq. When the enemy reached effective assault distance, it would be over. They'd be overrun. She looked back at the driver. His vitals were stabilizing, at least momentarily. He wasn't getting worse, which meant she could. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She moved back out of the vehicle, staying low. Rounds still cracked overhead, but she had something to do. On the ground near the driver's seat was an M4 carbine, fallen during the initial impact of the RPG. She picked it up, checked the magazine. Half full, not ideal but usable. She'd qualified as a gunner. She'd spent months training with these weapons. She'd logged hundreds of rounds on the range, had passed every proficiency test with flying colors. But more importantly, she'd spent the last 8 weeks training her mind to think tactically, to see the battlefield not as chaos but as a series of positions, fields of fire, and tactical problems to solve. Sarah moved to the right side of the first vehicle, establishing a position that gave her a view of the left hillside. The enemy fighters were staging there, preparing to move. She could see them clearly, Taliban fighters in mismatched uniforms, some in civilian clothes, all of them focused on advancing their ambush. She chambered a round, settled the rifle sights on the nearest target and fired. The enemy fighter dropped. Reeves turned, shocked, watching as Sarah methodically acquired the next target. Her second shot was clean. Her third shot wounded an enemy combatant who was attempting to flank their position. Suddenly, the enemy wasn't just dealing with a pinned team. They were dealing with a new threat, a shooter who knew what she was doing. Novik, fighting from his position in the second vehicle, realized what was happening. His radio call was immediate. "Second gunner is active on the left. 2 confirmed." The tactical dynamic shifted. Not dramatically, not enough to break the ambush, but enough to give them breathing room. The enemy couldn't advance anymore. They had to suppress this new threat. More of their fighters focused on Sarah's position. And Sarah Mitchell, combat medic, held her ground and fought. Sarah's first 2 shots had bought them seconds. Valuable, precious seconds. But the enemy was reorganizing, calling out adjustments, shifting their assault. More RPGs were being prepared. She could see it from her position. Fighters were moving ammunition, repositioning rocket launchers, preparing to rain more fire down on the convoy. They were getting ready for a sustained assault. She fired again, forcing one of the RPG teams to scatter. But her magazine was already running low. 3, maybe 4 more rounds before she'd need to reload. And when she reloaded, there would be those critical seconds of vulnerability. Behind her, in the command vehicle, Reeves was assessing the tactical situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 15 years of combat. He'd seen Sarah fire her shots. He'd recognized the discipline in her marksmanship, the way she was thinking tactically rather than emotionally. It was impressive. It was also problematic. She was a medic. An excellent medic, yes, but her primary role was medical support. The moment she became a combatant, she was no longer available for the people who would inevitably get hit. Thompson was bleeding from that shoulder wound. The driver would need advanced medical care soon, and in the next 30 minutes of fighting, others would fall. But watching the enemy advance despite her fire, Reeves understood something he didn't want to acknowledge. They didn't have a choice anymore. Sarah's magazine clicked empty. For that brief second of reload, there was a gap in their firepower. The enemy immediately exploited it, advancing 10 meters closer. She slammed the fresh magazine home and resumed fire, but the gap had cost them. Chen's voice crackled through the radio. "Command, we're losing suppression on the left ridge. They're going to have a clear assault path in 2 minutes." 2 minutes. At the enemy's current rate of advance, 2 minutes was enough time for them to close to effective assault distance. And at assault distance, with the number of fighters they had, it was over. Sarah crawled back to the command vehicle where Reeves was still manning the turret gun, still laying down fire, still thinking. She stayed low, moving between the vehicles, finally reaching him. His eyes were cold, focused, already running through tactical options that didn't exist. "Sir," she called out, having to nearly shout to be heard over the gunfire, "give me a rifle." Reeves didn't even look down at her. "Absolutely not. Stay in position as medical support, that's your—" "We don't have 2 minutes," Sarah interrupted, something she would normally never do to a commanding officer. But this wasn't normal. This was survival. "Your gunner is dead. Thompson is wounded. Novik is suppressing the right flank. Chen is pinned. You have 5 combat-effective personnel trying to hold off 30 fighters who are getting better positioned every second. You need every gun you can field. I need you alive and available for medical emergencies," Reeves shot back, finally glancing down at her. His expression was steely, immovable. "That's your role. I'm not compromising tactical." The explosion cut him off mid-sentence. An RPG detonated 50 meters away, close enough that they felt the concussion wave, close enough that fragments whistled through the air. Sarah covered her head instinctively. When she looked up, Reeves had blood on his face from a graze wound on his left cheekbone. He didn't seem to notice. "Sir," Sarah said, and there was something different in her voice now, not pleading but factual. "In 2 minutes we're going to be in close quarters combat. You're going to have casualties. When that happens, I can't help them if I'm hiding behind a vehicle praying we don't all die. But I can help you hold this position right now. I'm certified on small arms. I qualified as a combat gunner in my basic training. I've logged 400 hours of tactical rifle practice. I'm not asking to be a SEAL. I'm asking to stay alive." Reeves stared at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the base, Sarah saw something other than skepticism in his eyes. She saw calculation. She saw a commander wrestling with the impossible decision of choosing between doctrine and survival. Another burst of enemy fire raked across the vehicle, and this time a round punched through the windshield, striking the dashboard inches from Reeves' leg. "Thompson's down," Novik's voice screamed through the radio. "He took a round. We're losing the middle position." That was the moment. That was when Reeves made his decision. He reached down, unclipped the M4 from his tactical harness, his personal rifle, the weapon he trusted with his life, and held it towards Sarah. Their eyes met. His were gray, hard, absolutely certain. Hers were focused, ready, waiting. "Don't miss," he said simply. Sarah took the rifle, checked the chamber, verified the magazine. The weapon was familiar in her hands, comfortable in a way that surprised her. She'd trained with this exact model 100 times, but she'd never fired it in combat, never felt the weight of operational consequences hanging on her accuracy. "What's the situation?" she asked, her voice steady, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. "Left ridge is primary threat. They're moving a launcher team into position. Right flank is secondary. Center is holding but fragmentary. We've got air support inbound but 30 minutes out minimum. Our window is closing." Sarah nodded. No time for hesitation, no time for doubt. She moved back to her original position, this one armed with Reeves' rifle instead of the scavenged weapon. The M4 felt right in her hands. She acquired the ridge positions and immediately identified the launcher team Reeves had mentioned. They were setting up, calculating firing angles, preparing to rain more RPGs down on the convoy. She fired. The first fighter dropped. The second one scrambled for cover, but Sarah was already swinging to the next target. Her breathing was steady. Her heartbeat, despite the adrenaline, remained controlled. She could hear the shouting around her, the screams of combat, the constant roar of gunfire, but it all seemed distant now. There was only the rifle, the targets, and the absolute clarity of purpose. Another shot, another target acquired, another enemy combatant eliminated. From the radio she heard Chen, "What the hell, contact just shifted." "Second shooter is active," Reeves confirmed, and there was something new in his voice, not relief exactly, but a kind of grim acknowledgement. "Heavy weapons from the left ridge, multiple contacts down." Sarah fired again, and again. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was doing mathematics in real time, calculating trajectories, reading wind and distance, identifying which targets represented the greatest immediate threat. She was doing what she'd trained for, what she was capable of, and doing it with the kind of professional efficiency that separated competent shooters from dangerous ones. The enemy fire continued, but something had shifted. They'd been expecting 5 American shooters. Now they were dealing with 6. One of those 6 had superior positioning, superior accuracy, and the kind of calm under fire that only came from absolute training and absolute commitment. "Launcher team is breaking position," Novick reported, hope creeping into his voice for the first time. "They're pulling back." Sarah didn't pause or celebrate. She simply acquired the next target and squeezed the trigger. Her magazine would be empty in 90 seconds. After that, she'd be vulnerable again. But for now, for this critical moment, she was doing what needed to be done. And in the command vehicle, Lieutenant Commander Jake Reeves watched her work, watched her transition between targets with mechanical precision, watched her hold her ground under fire, watched her refuse to be limited by anyone's assumptions about what she could or couldn't do. And something fundamental shifted in his understanding of who she was. She wasn't just a good medic anymore. She was a warrior. Sarah's magazine ran dry at the 23-second mark of continuous fire. She ejected it with practiced efficiency and slammed home a fresh one from the pouch on her tactical vest. The whole operation took 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which the left ridge lost suppressive fire, but 4 seconds was no longer catastrophic. Novick on the right had shifted his angle to partially cover the gap. The enemy, recognizing the transition, advanced 5 meters but no more. "Shifting targets to right ridge," Sarah called out, her voice steady as if she were discussing the weather rather than directing lethal fire. Her training had taught her that tactical communication was as important as marksmanship. A shooter who didn't coordinate with the rest of the team was just noise. A shooter who communicated created force multiplication. "Copy," Reeves acknowledged from the command vehicle. "Right ridge secondary priority. Maintain left flank suppression." She understood immediately. The left ridge had the launcher team, the immediate existential threat. But the right ridge had riflemen who were beginning to find better positions, better angles. They were starting to outmaneuver the convoy's defensive perimeter. Sarah acquired a target, a Taliban fighter moving between rocks, clearly trying to get into an assault position, and fired. The fighter staggered, fell, didn't get up. "Contact left ridge bearing 270, Chen called out, his voice tight. "I'm pinned, can't suppress." This was the critical moment. The moment where everything could still go wrong. Chen was one of their best shooters, and if he was pinned, that meant the enemy had achieved local fire superiority in a critical sector. Sarah swung the rifle toward the left ridge, acquiring the position that Chen had identified. She could see the muzzle flashes of enemy fire, could track the trajectory, could calculate where the shooter must be positioned. She fired twice. Fast shots, not as carefully aimed as her others but well-trained and accurate. The enemy fire from that position ceased. Whether she'd killed the shooter or just forced them to relocate, she didn't know. She didn't have time to know. She was already looking for the next threat. Good, Chen breathed. Pressure is off, moving to establish a new position. This was what Sarah realized in that moment. This was what separated exceptional operators from merely competent ones. It wasn't just the ability to shoot. It was the ability to think systemically, to understand that every shot you fired changed the tactical picture, that every position you held or didn't hold had consequences for the entire team. She'd spent the last 8 weeks studying these men, watching how they thought, absorbing the tactical language and mindset. Now, under fire, with her adrenaline at maximum and her mind crystal clear, all that knowledge was crystallizing into operational reality. Reloading, she announced, transitioning to a fresh magazine. 23 rounds down, already a third of her ammunition gone. She had maybe 2 more magazines after this before she'd be in critical supply. But that was a problem for later. Right now, there was work to do. Movement from the center. The command vehicle's position. Thompson, bleeding from his shoulder wound, was trying to assess the damage. Sarah saw him wince, saw him favor his left arm, saw him struggling with the pain and shock of impact trauma. She made a decision that was simultaneously tactical and medical. Using the moments between targets, she moved back toward the center position, staying low, using the vehicles as cover. The rifle remained ready, slung across her chest, but for these seconds she was transitioning back to her primary role. "Let me see it," she said, already examining Thompson's shoulder. The entry wound was high, probably missed the collarbone by inches, possibly had struck the anterior deltoid or the tissue surrounding it. The exit wound told her the round had passed through, which meant no projectile lodged in the wound. Better than the alternative, but still serious. "I can keep fighting," Thompson insisted, his jaw clenched against pain. "You can fight," Sarah agreed, already applying pressure to both wounds with tactical gauze. "But you're going to fight smarter. You're going to shoot from a supported position. You're not going to move that arm above shoulder height, and you're going to let me tape this down to stabilize it." She worked with complete focus, tapping his shoulder immobile while Thompson directed fire with his right arm only. It was awkward, imprecise, and still more effective than having him sitting idle. Within 60 seconds, she was done and moving back to her position. "Contact 200 meters, bearing 115, Novak called out. Enemy moving to establish a secondary assault position. Sarah acquired the target. A group of Taliban fighters, maybe 8 of them, moving through a ravine that would put them in perfect assault distance within minutes. They had discipline and coordinated movement. These weren't militia fighters or untrained insurgents. These were soldiers, trained and experienced. She began engaging them systematically. Not panicked, not emotional, but methodical. Each shot was calculated. The first fighter went down. The others immediately sought cover, but the ravine offered limited options. The second fighter made a break for deeper cover. Sarah led him slightly and fired. He dropped mid-stride. "Multiple contacts in ravine are being suppressed," she reported. "Estimate 8 fighters, engaging." Her third shot clipped a fighter in the leg, not lethal but incapacitating. The fighter fell, began crawling back toward deeper cover. Sarah let him go. There were 4 more targets with clear lines of fire, and she needed to maintain pressure. The enemy was adapting. She could see it in their movement, in the way they were adjusting tactics in real time. They were attempting to flank around the convoy's positions, using the terrain, trying to find the gaps in the defensive perimeter. And they would have succeeded. The gaps were there. The convoy was understaffed. The defensive positions were marginal at best. But Sarah was filling those gaps. Every shot she fired was a gap closed, a threat eliminated, a moment of breathing room created for the rest of the team. "Air support is 10 minutes out," Reeves' voice came through the radio. "Maintain suppression. We just need to hold for 10 minutes." 10 minutes. It felt simultaneously like an eternity and a moment. Sarah's ammunition count was getting critical. She was down to her last magazine and a half. After that, she'd be back to scavenged weapons and improvisation. But those 10 minutes would change everything. She transitioned to a new target, a Taliban commander, identifiable by his body language and the way fighters were clustering around him. He was organizing a coordinated assault, gathering forces for a final push. Sarah recognized the tactical picture and understood immediately. This was a critical node in the enemy's command structure. If she could eliminate it, it would buy them time. The distance was extreme, maybe 300 meters. A difficult shot, but not impossible. She adjusted for wind, distance, elevation change. She controlled her breathing. She became one with the rifle. She fired. The Taliban commander fell. Immediately, the fighters around him began panicking, looking for orders that weren't coming, losing cohesion. It was a small thing, one life taken, but it had exponential tactical consequences. The assault formation that had been developing began to collapse. "What the hell did you just do?" Chen asked, amazement clear in his voice. "Eliminated the command structure," Sarah replied simply. "They're reorganizing." And they were. But now they were doing it without their leadership, without clear direction, without the kind of coordinated assault that might have overwhelmed the convoy's defenses. They were fragmenting, becoming a collection of firefights rather than a unified tactical operation. Sarah transitioned her rifle to cover the right flank as Novik called out a new threat. She moved with complete confidence, no longer thinking about the fact that she was in combat, no longer questioning her role or her capabilities. She was operating at that level where training and instinct merged into pure competence. This was who she was. This had always been who she was. She just needed the opportunity to prove it. Behind her, in the command vehicle, Reeves watched her work, watched her transition seamlessly between roles, between shooters and medical care, between targets and tactical awareness. Watched her maintain perfect composure while managing ammunition, managing communications, managing the impossible situation they were trapped in. He'd sent her here as a medic, expecting her to stay behind the lines, to treat wounds, to be a support function. He'd never expected this. He'd never imagined that she would prove to be not just competent at combat operations, but exceptional at them. The 10 minutes began to feel less like an eternity and more like a finite countdown. And with each minute that passed, Sarah Mitchell proved something that would change not just this mission, not just this team, but the very understanding of what was possible. 7 minutes into the countdown, the enemy made their final coordinated push. Sarah saw it coming before it happened. The way the sporadic fire intensified, the way enemy fighters began consolidating positions, the way they were gathering themselves for one last assault. It was the move of a force running out of options, recognizing that if they didn't break through the American defenses in the next few minutes, they never would. "Heavy concentration forming on the left," Novik called out. "Multiple fighters, looks like assault prep." Sarah was already moving toward the left ridge, her rifle slung and ready. Her last full magazine was in the weapon. She had maybe 38 rounds left in the world. 38 rounds to hold off what looked like 15 to 20 enemy fighters preparing to charge directly at their position. "I see them," she replied calmly, "standing by." The assault began with an explosion, a grenade poorly thrown landing short of their position but close enough to pepper the vehicles with small rocks and dust. Then the fighters began moving, bounding between positions, laying down suppressive fire as they advanced. It was organized, disciplined, and terrifying in its coordination. These were Taliban cadre, trained soldiers, not random militants. But they'd made a critical mistake. They'd come during the daylight and Sarah had superior positioning. They'd come when she still had ammunition. They'd come after she'd already spent 30 minutes understanding the terrain, understanding their movement patterns, understanding how they thought tactically. Sarah began engaging targets with mechanical precision. The first fighter went down at 150 meters, the second at 180. She wasn't trying to be heroic. She was doing mathematics in blood and brass, calculating the rate of advance, the diminishing distance, the moment when they would reach effective assault range. Multiple targets engaged, she reported. Estimate 4 contacts eliminated, assault wave still advancing. Reeves was coordinating everyone now, shifting fire, consolidating positions, maximizing their defensive firepower. Chen had moved to a new position that gave him a better angle on the assault formation. Thompson, despite his wounded shoulder, was laying down fire with his right arm only, constrained but still effective. Novik was calling out ranges and bearings with the precision of a veteran. And Sarah was the center of gravity, the position that made the entire defensive network possible. The enemy assault formation was dying, not because of any single gun, but because of coordinated fire that made forward movement suicide. The Taliban commander on this assault wave, not the one Sarah had eliminated earlier, but the leader of this specific push, was screaming orders, trying to keep his fighters moving, trying to maintain momentum. Sarah saw him directing fire from a position 50 meters from their location. She calculated the shot. Medium distance, clear line of fire, high-value target. She fired. The commander fell mid-sentence, his body collapsing into the dust. Immediately, the assault formation lost cohesion. The fighters still moving forward began backing up, looking for orders that weren't coming. The assault that had seemed so threatening 30 seconds earlier evaporated into fragmented individuals seeking cover. Assault elements breaking contact, Novik reported. They're falling back. But falling back didn't mean defeated. It meant regrouping, repositioning, preparing for another attempt. They still had time before air support arrived. 4 minutes. The enemy could reorganize and attack again in 4 minutes. Sarah transitioned her rifle, scanning for the next threat. That's when she heard the most beautiful sound she'd heard in the last hour, the distant beating of helicopter rotors. Air support is 2 minutes out, Reeves announced. Maintain suppression. They're breaking, we just need to hold 2 more minutes. The Apache gunship appeared on the horizon like an avenging angel, its silhouette unmistakable. The Taliban fighters saw it too. Their coordinated assault had turned into a rout. Fighters who minutes earlier had been disciplined soldiers were now running, abandoning positions, trying to get off the ridge and into terrain where the helicopter couldn't reach them. Sarah watched them go, tracking a few of the fastest with her rifle, choosing not to fire. They'd broken. The siege had shifted. The tactical picture had transformed from "we might not survive this" to "we're going to survive this." The Apache opened fire. The sound was indescribable, a chain gun tearing through the air, ammunition expending at a rate that seemed almost obscene. Enemy fighters on the ridge were cut down mid-stride. Their positions were obliterated. The overwhelming firepower of a combat helicopter did in seconds what the ground team had fought to accomplish for 40 minutes. Sarah lowered her rifle and looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear anymore, but from the slow release of adrenaline, from the recognition that the immediate threat had passed. Blood, hers and others, had dried on her forearms. Her uniform was soaked with sweat and dust. Her ears were ringing from sustained gunfire. But she was alive. They were all alive. The convoy had held. Reeves' voice came over the radio, directing the Apache to suppress enemy movement on the far ridge, to establish a perimeter around their position, to prepare for follow-on operations. His voice was steady, professional, already thinking ahead to extraction and casualty evacuation. Sarah began moving through their position, checking on team members. Thompson's shoulder wound needed proper medical attention, but the bleeding had slowed with her initial treatment. Novik had a shrapnel wound on his leg but was mobile and functional. Chen was unhurt but exhausted. Watts had taken a round through the arm but was mobile and conscious. And the driver from the lead vehicle, the one Sarah had first treated when the ambush began, was awake now, confused but stable. He'd regained consciousness moments earlier and was trying to understand what had happened. "You were hit by shrapnel," Sarah explained, examining his head wound. The bleeding had stopped. Her initial assessment had been correct: concussion, probably some minor internal bleeding but survivable. "You're going to feel like hell, but you're going to be fine." As she worked, she became aware of a presence beside her. She looked up to find Reeves standing there, watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. His face was covered in dust and blood from the graze wound on his cheek. His uniform was torn in multiple places, but his eyes were clear, focused, and different from how they'd looked at her before. "How's Thompson?" he asked. "Shoulder wound. Clean through, nothing critical hit. He's going to recover fully with proper medical treatment." "And him," Reeves gestured to the driver. "Concussion, possible mild intracranial bleeding but stable. He'll need imaging and observation, but he should be fine." Reeves nodded slowly. Then he looked at Sarah directly, and for a long moment he simply studied her face. He paused, searching for words. "That was extraordinary." It wasn't effusive, it wasn't emotional, but it was genuine, and it was everything. Sarah had heard Reeves give orders to soldiers who'd done remarkable things, and he'd always been professional but measured. This was different. There was something in his voice that acknowledged not just competence, but something beyond that. "I did my job," Sarah said simply. "You did more than your job." Reeves looked out at the ridge where the assault had been broken, where the Taliban fighters were retreating into the mountains. "You saved this entire team. Not because you're a good medic, because you're a good operator." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Recognition, acceptance, the moment where the skepticism finally transformed into genuine respect. "We held the line," she said quietly, "all of us together." "We held the line because you wouldn't accept limitations," Reeves replied. He turned back to her, and there was something almost like a smile on his face. "Don't forget that. Don't ever forget that you proved something here that matters." The Apache continued to suppress enemy movement on the far ridge. In the distance, Sarah could hear more helicopters, transport birds inbound for casualty evacuation. The immediate crisis was over. The siege had been broken. But more importantly, Sarah had been transformed. From a medic that a commanding officer tolerated to an operator that a commanding officer respected. From someone trying to prove herself to someone who had proven herself absolutely. And that transformation, once complete, could never be reversed. The medevac helicopters landed in sequence, their rotors kicking up a dust storm that turned the valley into a chaos of wind and noise. Sarah watched as medical personnel moved with practiced efficiency, loading the wounded onto the transport birds. Thompson went first, his shoulder properly immobilized now, his face pale from blood loss and shock. The driver from the lead vehicle was next, still confused but stable, his head wound documented and stable vitals confirmed. Novik, Watts, and 2 Army Rangers with various injuries followed. By the time the last helicopter lifted off, carrying their casualties toward the surgical facility in Kandahar, the immediate crisis had truly ended. The perimeter was secured. The Apache maintained overhead coverage as the convoy began assessing damage and casualty reports. The body count on the ridge was extraordinary. The Taliban had left behind 37 fighters killed in action, multiple weapons caches, and documentation suggesting this had been a planned ambush targeting specifically the intelligence-gathering mission. Someone had leaked their operational details. Someone had coordinated a sophisticated attack designed to eliminate an entire American team. And they'd failed. Sarah stood in the middle of the convoy's position, her uniform still soaked with blood and sweat, her rifle hanging loosely across her chest. The adrenaline had fully faded now, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made her feel like she was moving through water. Around her, the team was conducting the post-operation assessment, checking ammunition counts, documenting casualties, beginning the preliminary after-action report. Chen approached her carrying a bottle of water. "Drink this," he said, not asking, just directing. "You're going into shock." Sarah accepted the water and drank deeply. The coolness was shocking, necessary. "How many total casualties?" she asked. "Ours, 5 wounded, 1 critical before the medevac. Could have been much worse." Chen paused, and there was something heavy in his silence. "Could have been all of us. Reeves is putting in the initial report now, but everyone knows what happened here. Everyone knows what you did." "What we all did," Sarah corrected automatically. "No," Chen's voice was firm. "I've been in this business for 12 years, Sarah. I've seen extraordinary things. I've seen men do impossible things. But what you did in the last 40 minutes, that was different. That was someone who refused to be limited by anyone's expectations. That was someone who saw what needed to be done and did it, consequences be damned." Before Sarah could respond, Reeves emerged from the command vehicle, his uniform as bloody and worn as hers. He'd already been on the radio, coordinating with higher command, beginning the intelligence exploitation of the captured documents. His mind was already moving to the next operation, the next threat assessment. But when he saw Sarah, he stopped. "Mitchell," he said, walking toward her. "My office, 20 minutes, get cleaned up first." It wasn't a request. Sarah made her way to the FOBS shower facilities, a brutal 55-degree water experience that nonetheless felt like salvation. She scrubbed the blood and dust away, watching it swirl down the drain, hers and others, the physical manifestation of the violence she'd been part of. Her hands were shaking again as she cleaned under her fingernails. Adrenaline aftermath or trauma response, she wasn't sure. Probably both. She changed into fresh utilities and reported to Reeves' office 20 minutes later, exactly as ordered. The office was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, filing cabinets, maps on the wall. Reeves was sitting behind the desk, and for the first time, Sarah noticed how exhausted he looked. Not physically exhausted, though that was present too. This was the exhaustion of command, of responsibility, of having his decisions weighed against the lives of people under his authority. "Close the door," he said. Sarah did. "Sit down." She sat. For a long moment, Reeves simply looked at her. His eyes were different now, no longer skeptical, no longer assessing whether she belonged. They were the eyes of someone who had seen capability tested under the absolute worst conditions and found it to be real. "When you arrived at this base," he began slowly, "I made a decision about who you were. I decided that you were a medic and that medics had a specific role and that you would stay in that role regardless of your training or capability. I let assumptions override evidence. I let bias overcome logic." He paused. "That was a mistake." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close. Sarah waited, understanding that Reeves was wrestling with something deeper than simple professional courtesy. "I've spent 15 years building this team," Reeves continued. "I've hand-selected every operator. I've trained them, pushed them, demanded excellence in every metric. I have one of the most successful teams in special operations because I know who I'm working with, because I trust them with my life." He looked directly at Sarah. "Today, you made me trust you with not just my life but with the lives of 5 other people. You proved that trust was warranted." "I did my job," Sarah said simply. "You did your job and then some," Reeves replied. "You crossed a line today. You stopped being support and became an operator. The question now is whether you want to stay there." Sarah felt her heartbeat accelerate. "Sir, I'm recommending to command that you be assigned as a tactical operator on the full roster, not in addition to your medic duties, alongside them. You maintain your medical certification and continue providing field support, but you're also a combat asset, a full member of this team. He leaned back in his chair. If you want it. The question hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about the last 40 minutes, the terror and clarity, the weight of the rifle, the moment when she'd stopped thinking about proving herself and started simply doing what needed to be done. She thought about her wife waiting for her back home, about the texts and calls that would come once word of this operation reached official channels. She thought about what it meant to accept a role that came with exponentially more danger and responsibility. Yes, she said, I want it. Reeves nodded slowly. Good, because I've already submitted the paperwork. Command is approving it tomorrow morning. He stood, extending his hand across the desk. Welcome to the team, Captain Mitchell, officially this time. Sarah stood and shook his hand. The grip was firm, the gesture genuine. This wasn't ceremony. This was a binding agreement between two professionals who had proven themselves to each other. Word of the recommendation spread through the base in hours. By the time Sarah reached the dining facility for her first meal since the operation, the entire SEAL team was there waiting. They stood when she entered, a silent gesture of respect that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Chen grinned. Heard you got your commission, he said. Provisional assignment, Sarah corrected, but she was smiling. 1 mission trial basis. You're going to pass, Watts said confidently. That was the most incredible combat shooting I've ever seen. You should have been there when she took out the commander, Novick added. 300-meter shot. No hesitation, just calculated and executed. They sat together, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the base, Sarah felt like she was actually part of the team rather than an addition to it. The skepticism was gone, replaced by genuine camaraderie. They asked her about specific moments, specific shots, specific decisions. They treated her tactical thinking with the same respect they treated their own. Over the following weeks, Sarah flew 3 more missions with the SEAL team. On each mission, she operated as a full tactical member alongside her medical duties. She coordinated with Reeves on assault positions. She provided suppressive fire during an extraction operation. She neutralized a sniper threat that could have endangered the entire team. And with each mission, the team's trust deepened, and the skepticism that had defined her arrival at the base became increasingly distant. But it was a conversation with a visiting general officer that truly crystallized what had changed. General Morrison had come to the base to understand the ambush operation, to assess lessons learned, to document the engagement for training purposes. During his briefing, Reeves had presented Sarah's actions with the kind of professional clarity he brought to everything. When the briefing ended, Morrison asked to speak with Sarah privately. That was extraordinary tactical thinking under pressure, he said. I've been reading the after-action reports. Your decisions, the command structure elimination, the ammunition conservation, the coordination with Reeves, that's operator-level thinking. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. The Pentagon is very interested in your story, Morrison continued. Not as inspiration or motivation, but as documentation that tactical capability isn't determined by traditional categories. Your performance proves something that some in leadership still doubt. He paused. Are you willing to talk about what happened? Help us train the next generation. Sarah thought about it. She thought about the young female soldiers at bases around the country, wondering if they belonged, if they were capable, if the walls around them were insurmountable. Yes, sir, she said, I'd be honored. And so began the next chapter of her story, not just as a combat operator, but as a symbol of what became possible when capability was recognized and potential was unleashed. 6 months after the Lager Province ambush, Sarah sat in a small conference room at the Pentagon, watching a presentation about herself. It was surreal in a way she couldn't adequately describe. Photographs from the operation, tactical diagrams showing her positioning, after-action reports detailing her decisions, all of it compiled into a 30-minute briefing for senior military leadership. A colonel from the Training and Doctrine Command stood at the podium. Captain Mitchell's actions represent a fundamental shift in how we should assess capability within our force structure, he was saying. Her performance wasn't exceptional because she's a woman. It was exceptional because she refused to accept predetermined limitations on her role and demonstrated the tactical thinking that separates good operators from extraordinary ones. The room was full of generals, strategic planners, policymakers. Some nodded along, others looked skeptical. The skepticism didn't bother Sarah anymore. She'd moved past needing validation from people who hadn't earned her respect. After the briefing, a two-star general named Patricia Hendricks, one of the highest-ranking women in the Army, asked to speak with Sarah privately. "Your story is going to matter," Hendricks said without preamble. "Not as inspiration porn, which is what some people will try to make it, but as concrete evidence that our assumptions about capability are often based on bias rather than reality." She studied Sarah carefully. "How do you feel about being a symbol?" "I don't want to be a symbol," Sarah replied honestly. "I want to be a soldier doing her job." "You can be both," Hendricks said. "The trick is not letting the symbol overshadow the soldier." She handed Sarah a folder. "This is a proposal for a task force on institutional bias in special operations. Your insights would be invaluable." Sarah considered it. A year ago, she would have jumped at the opportunity. Now she understood that there was value in staying operational, in continuing to do the work she loved. "I'll consider it," she said, "but I'd like to complete at least one full rotation with my team first." Hendricks smiled. "That's the right answer. Stay grounded in reality. That's what makes your perspective worth listening to." The next 6 months passed in a blur of operational deployments and administrative duties. Sarah flew 7 more combat missions with the SEAL team. She led an assault on a Taliban logistics compound. She conducted overwatch for a village security operation. She trained young operators in tactical medicine and combat decision-making. And with each operation, she proved that her performance at Lager wasn't an anomaly. It was representative of her genuine capability. But it was the unexpected meeting with a young female soldier that truly crystallized why her story mattered. Captain Rebecca Torres was a medic with the 82nd Airborne, on rotation through the base for advanced training. She approached Sarah hesitantly after a briefing on combat medical procedures. "I wanted to thank you," Torres said, "not just for the training but for everything, your story." "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said, though she did understand. "I almost left the military," Torres admitted. "I got my commission and the constant dismissal, the assumption that I was support staff, that I'd never be seen as a real operator. It wore me down. I was going to request discharge." She paused. "Then I read the after-action report from your ambush, and I realized that someone like me had said no to being limited, and I thought, why shouldn't I?" Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This was what General Hendricks had meant. This was the ripple effect that went beyond any single operation. "You should stay," Sarah said firmly. "Not because I did something extraordinary, but because you have capabilities inside you that are waiting to be discovered and utilized. That's the only reason anyone should stay in this profession." Tor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you." Sarah watched her walk away, and she thought about the young women at 50 other military installations across the country, the ones who would read about the SEAL medic who picked up a rifle and changed the tactical situation. Some would be inspired. Some would think it was impossible. But some, like Tor's, would understand that the limitations they'd accepted were just walls waiting to be broken down. When Sarah finally completed her rotation in Afghanistan and returned to the States, her wife was waiting at the airport. Emma Mitchell had supported every deployment, every late night at the office, every moment of doubt. She'd been the constant when everything else was chaos. "Welcome home," Emma said, embracing her tightly. "Good to be home," Sarah replied and meant it deeply. Over the following weeks, Sarah adjusted to being back in the States, but she quickly realized that the operation in Lager had changed more than just her professional status. Media outlets wanted interviews. Military publications requested feature articles. Speaking invitations came from universities, from officer training programs, from military academies. She accepted selectively. She gave a talk at West Point where she spoke not about the ambush itself, but about the importance of recognizing capability across all demographics. She participated in a round-table discussion with Army leadership about institutional change. She mentored young female officers, giving them the kind of realistic perspective she would have valued when she was coming up. But her most important work was happening in the training programs she developed. Sarah created a comprehensive course on decision-making under extreme stress that became mandatory at multiple special operations centers. The course wasn't about teaching people to be tactical operators. It was about teaching people to recognize their own capabilities, to understand how bias, both internal and external, limited performance, and to develop the mental discipline necessary to function at peak effectiveness when everything was chaos. Young soldiers from all branches, all backgrounds, all demographics cycled through her training program. And in every cohort, there were young women who approached her privately to say that her example had shown them what was possible. One evening, as she was preparing for a training session, Chen knocked on her office door. He'd been promoted to Master Chief Petty Officer and was now serving in an administrative capacity at the Special Operations Command. "I wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "The Navy is considering a Special Operations Command specifically for training female operators in advanced tactical roles. They want you to head the program." Sarah looked up from her work. "That's a significant position." "It is," Chen agreed. "And you're the right person for it. Not because of what happened in Lager, though that certainly helps, but because of what you've done since. You've taken an exceptional moment and turned it into systemic change. That's the hardest thing to do." Sarah considered it. The position would be mostly administrative. She'd spend more time in offices than in the field. But she'd also be in a position to influence how the next generation of female operators was trained and developed. "I'll take it," she said. That night she called her wife. "I might be getting a new assignment," she explained the opportunity. "It would be good for my career, but it means less time in the field." "Are you happy about it?" Emma asked. "Yes," Sarah said, and realized it was true. "I think I'm ready for the next chapter." 2 years later, Sarah stood in front of a group of 32 female soldiers, the first cohort of the Navy's specialized tactical operator training program. They ranged in age from 22 to 38, came from different backgrounds, different branches, different specializations. But they shared one thing: they refused to accept the limitations that others had tried to place on them. "I'm going to tell you something that I learned the hard way," Sarah said to them. "Capability isn't determined by anyone's expectations of you. It's determined by your willingness to refuse those limitations and prove what's actually possible." She paused. "I came to my team as a medic, and I was expected to stay a medic. I accepted that limitation for exactly 8 weeks. Then I picked up a rifle and changed the tactical situation." She showed them the after-action reports. She showed them the photographs from the operation. But more importantly, she showed them the countless other examples, soldiers from other branches, other units, who had pushed beyond what others believed they were capable of. "You're going to face skepticism," Sarah continued. "You're going to be told that you're not cut out for this, that your gender makes you unsuitable for combat operations, that you should accept support roles and be grateful." She looked directly at them. "I'm telling you now that all of that is bullshit. Your capability isn't determined by gender. It's determined by training, courage, and refusal to accept limitations." The training program became one of the most rigorous in the Special Operations Command. The pass rate was 30%, the same as the male-only programs. 53 women graduated in that first year, and they went on to serve with distinction across multiple military branches. But perhaps most importantly, something fundamental shifted in the culture around special operations. The assumption that capability was binary, that you were either a support operator or a tactical operator, began to fade. People were evaluated on their actual performance, not on predetermined categories. Sarah never sought out that transformation. She never consciously tried to be a symbol. She'd simply looked at an impossible situation, recognized what needed to be done, and refused to accept that it was beyond her capability. Years later, when she was asked about her legacy, Sarah would say the same thing. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what was necessary when it mattered most." The real change comes when that becomes normal instead of exceptional. And that was the ultimate victory. Not that Sarah Mitchell had picked up a rifle and changed one battle, but that she demonstrated that capability could be found anywhere, and that refusing to accept limitations could become a philosophy that transformed institutions.